copies of the sources. I mean, I'm going to share the screen anyway, but I don't know if that was easier. Let me make sure I share the right one. Okay, and let me blow it up a little bit.
It's okay now.
Okay, is that clear?
Yep.
We see it.
Okay. Where I thought we came off a little while ago on the story on the events of Meron. I don't want to deal with the horrible tragedy of Meron, but I want to discuss a little bit about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's good for, as you'll see, it's good for discussion of Matan Torah as well. I don't know if we'll do all of the pieces on this Daf Makarot. We'll cover what we cover. I was told this goes to 11:45. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we'll see how we're doing. We'll see how I'm feeling, you're feeling, and we'll go from there. There are a few Agadot. One thing that I like to tell my students when we learn Agadot is often stories. They've heard stories when they're little kids. They heard stories when they were much younger, and therefore they make certain assumptions about just the I don't know the what Chazal were doing. They take the stories as they learned them when they were 5 or 6 or 10, and they don't take them very seriously. They're just nice little cute stories, are there people in the waiting room? Is someone else taking care of like waiting room things, or I have to do that? I'll admit anyway. So they often look at Agadot like they did as little kids, and there's a nice aspect to that because stories, even for young people, are very meaningful. I once heard Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. This I heard from Rav David Ebner suggested this. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, when he first started teaching, taught very complex Hasidic Torahs that were full of Kabbalah and full of quotations and very intricate thoughts. And he discovered a lot of people just didn't follow him and didn't understand him. So later on, he switched to storytelling because he felt he could convey complex ideas in ways that were, as they say in the Gemara, Shabla Kol Nefesh, that would reach out to everyone. I think it's important when we approach Agadot in general to take them very seriously. They do communicate on multiple levels. They could be understood by kids. They can be understood by young people and people who want to understand them superficially. But the stories, I think, the goal, the reason that Chazal put them together and then put them into the Gemara is because they're trying to convey very sophisticated, complex theological ideas, and even struggling with those ideas in a manner which is just easily digestible. But if you unpack them slowly, one gets the feeling that there's a lot under the surface that people often miss. I came across an academic. I was reading years ago. I was reading a book on rabbinic literature by a professor of Talmud. And the professor had suggested that the rabbis who wrote the various story parts, the Agadot in the Gemara, they couldn't be the same rabbis who wrote the halachic sections of the Gemara, because how could one person, or one group of people be adept at two completely different types of literature, kind of bifurcating between the halakha on the one hand and Agadot on the other. I felt like this person never bothered to read any of the works by Rabbi Soloveitchik, or my teacher of Lichtenstein, or many people who have, or even the Marsha on the Gemara, who wrote both in the halakhic sections and the Agadic sections. So I don't buy into that fabricated bifurcation. I think that the same people who are writing halakhic literature were writing these Agadot, and are trying to convey something just in a completely different form. So we're going to look at a halachic one to begin with as an introduction kind of to Rosh Yochai, and then we're going to look at the more famous thing. So are we going to ask anyone? I know this is weird on Zoom. It's always hard to communicate. But when we start talking about Rosh Yochai, the most famous component of Rosh Yochai, of course, is when he ran to hide. Where did he hide?
Cherub tree.
What?
Cherub tree.
Let me see
Carob tree.
the location.
Yeah, in the cave.
Right, in the cave. So we'll see that's what everyone knows, and it's not completely true. It is true on one level, but we'll see there's actually components to that, and we'll try and eke that apart. So what I'm going to try and do is give a little picture of the world of Shimon bar Yochai. In the 1980s, someone, Jacob Neusner, came along and kind of threw a wrench in what had been classic methodology of interpreting the rabbis. People, academics like Louis Finkelstein, and then people from Bar Ilan, like what's his name, who wrote on Elias Meherkinos. They used to write biographies of the rabbis of the Talmud, and then Neusner came along to complain that you can't necessarily do that, but we're going to do it anyway. I'm going to ignore Jacob Neusner and talk about Shimon bar Yochai and his what I think is consistent throughout many Agadot and Shas. Yeah?
Good morning. Let's do it.
Okay, so we're good. So we'll jump right in. The first is a famous Gemara about the nature of work. So that's the Gemara in Brachot, and where Shimon Yochai plays a very prominent role. Just to get us up to speed on understanding who Shimon Yochai was, Shimon Yochai was, we know we're in the middle of Sfiras Omer. It's almost over. We didn't. I enjoyed not saying Tachton this morning, I have to admit. It's a funny thing in the Mishnah Brura. My daughter got married. I married off my first daughter to get married. It was complicated because of COVID. So the Chatan, my son-in-law, is from LA, and his parents were supposed to come in. And we were going to have the wedding before Pesach, but because of various inabilities to make it, they eventually got permits right before Erev Pesach. They got permits to come. They came on Pesach. We had the wedding right after Pesach, right before Rosh Chodesh. That was a whatever with Sfiras Omer. We know there's all these issues with when and what. But with Sfiras Omer, the famous thing with Sfiras Omer is that the Avelut is because of the death of Rabbi Akiva's students. So Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 or 24,000 pairs of students, or 12,000 pairs of students, 24,000 students who passed away. But afterwards, after those students passed away, he developed 5 main famous students who become the backbone of the Mishnah. Yehuda bar Ilai, Rosi bar Chalafta, Rabbi Elazar ben Shemoah, Rabbi Meir, and Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai. So the period of time we're talking about is a little bit after the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Chorban Beit HaMikdash, the temple is destroyed. Years later, around 135 or so, the Bar Kokhba rebellion, Rabbi Akiva was an old man, and then his next generation of students take over, and we're going to be talking about that next generation of students, the ones who eventually all move up north in the wake of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And again, all these famous rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai, Rabbi bar Chalafta, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, they all were students of Rabbi Akiva, and they're all going to play roles here. So let's start with the Gemara as a prelude to the real Gemara. The real Gemara is going to be about the cave, but I want to do the prelude first, and then we'll talk about the cave case. So the Gemara in Brachot begins the following. Tanu Rabbanan. So we have a Braita, and the Braita quotes a Pasuk. V'asat degenecha. Why does the Torah say v'asat degenecha? The context of that pasuk, of course, is, literally it means, and you shall collect your grain. So we see this in Krishma, you'll plant and you'll sow, you follow the words of Akash Baruch Hu, and then after the farmers have plowed the land and planted and the whole winter, then they can collect their grain. And the Torah says, and then collect your grain. Now, I don't know, do we have any farmers in this illustrious group? My father loved gardening. My father owned a scrapyard, but he loved gardening. And our original house, he had the yard, it was in Florida. And he grew up in Iowa, so I guess he just loved being outside because when he grew up in Iowa, you couldn't really be outside ever in the wintertime. But grew up in plants, and we used to have a huge vegetable garden. Half the yard was a vegetable garden. We grew everything, corn and radishes and tomatoes, etc. But a person who plants, who works the whole winter, starting from after Sukkot to clear the land and then plant it and then harvest it, no one needs to tell them to go harvest the grain. Like, what would you do if you're not, that was the point. So why does the Torah say, oh, and by the way, go harvest your grain? So that's the problem the Gemara is upset about, or the Braita is upset about. Ma tamad lomar. Why does the Torah say to the farmer, after you've spent all your time planting, go harvest? We know you have to harvest. We know that's what you're going to do. So the Braita continues, L'fi shene'emar, because the pasuk says to Yoshua, and Sefer Yoshua lo yamush sefer Torah zeh mipicha, because the Torah told Yoshua that he should always be learning Torah. Yachol, I would have thought the following: Devarim kiktavan. I would have thought, take that literally. You should be learning Torah yomam v'layla. If you're learning Torah all the time, then how are you going to have time to harvest? Talmud lomar v'asav degenecha. The Torah therefore says to the farmer, collect your grain. Hanheg behem minhag derech eretz. You should relate to your work like derech eretz. Derech eretz is a changing term in the history of Am Yisrael. Later on, derech eretz is often, the ganenet will say to the kids, derech eretz, to be polite, to be nice. In certain contexts, some of the Hirsch made a big deal out of Torah derech eretz, Torah with being worldly to some degree, or perhaps even pronounced. But here it means act normally. You should learn Torah, but integrate the Torah into your normal life, which includes a parnasa. You have to work for a living. So if you plan to, don't think that you should just learn all the time and you'll just ignore harvest season. The Torah is actually telling you, no, go harvest. That overrides the mitzvah of Talmud Torah for that period of time. And that's Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, who's a little bit earlier than Rosh Yochai. Rosh Yochai disagrees. Rosh Yochai says, let's see if I'll let anybody in. Nope, we're good? Okay. Rosh Yochai says, wait, what are you talking about? Omer, he says the following. Efshar Adam Charesh B'Shat Charisha. Is it possible that a person will plow at the plowing time? V'Zoreya B'Shat Zriya. And he will sow at the time of seeds. V'Kotzer B'Shat Katsira. And he'll harvest at harvest time. V'Dash B'Shat Disha. And he'll thresh at the threshing time. V'Zoreh B'Shat Haruach. And he'll winnow in the winnowing time. Now we can actually figure this out because usually wheat, so wheat, we know, I don't know, I live in a frat. We don't have wheat fields, but right below my house, we have grape vineyards. Actually, on Yom Yerushalayim, my son and I took a hike to the grape vineyards. The grape vineyards are owned by Arabs. There was almost no one there. There was like a couple Arabs there. I think most people, because it was so hot and it was Ramadan, they just weren't around. So almost no one was around. But we can more or less work out the wheat harvest, the wheat cycle in Israel. So the time around Sukkot time is when they clear the ground to prepare it for the upcoming winter season. It's all clear. So they'll plow it and get it ready. They'll start to seed the wheat sometime in the winter. The wheat starts to grow, as we know, around Pesach time. That's before and after Pesach. So springtime is when you would do katsira, you do harvesting at the end of spring, early summer. And then in the summertime, when you've piled up all the wheat, you would dash, do threshing. And then we know the winds start to really pick up at the end of the summer. I know in a frat area, the wind really picks up. Remember, all this is in Eretz Yisrael. So it really picks up, and that's when you would winnow, because they would thresh the wheat. I told my students, we lost this book. I don't know you've had this experience with our kids. We've had numerous kiddie books over the course of years. I have 8 children, and we've had all kinds of books and scholastic books. There's a wonderful book called Pancake, which kind of spells out in picture form. This kid wakes up and says to his mom, it takes place like 19th century pictures, and says to his mom, Mom, I want a pancake. And she says, okay, great. Go to the field and harvest some wheat. So he goes and harvests some wheat. He's all excited. And he comes back, okay, I harvested the wheat. She goes, great. Now you got to thresh the wheat, Okay, thresh the wheat and winnow the wheat and grind the wheat into flour, etc. So we know if you're winnowing around the end of the summer to store the grain for the winter time. So you've had plowing at the beginning of the winter, seeding in the middle of the winter, harvesting in the spring, early summer, threshing in the summer, winnowing at the end of the summer, early winter, early fall, right? Torah Matehalia. What's going to happen? When are you going to learn? You just spent the whole year involved in agriculture. You have no time to learn. So Shimon Yochai says, Rabbi Shmuel, what you're saying is great, but no one's ever going to learn Torah because they're too busy working. Ela Bizman Shishrael. So Rabbi Shimon Yochai understands the Torah totally differently. It's not telling you that you should manheg dehem derech eretz, that you should function with also working and also learning Torah. The opposite. El Bizman Shishrael Sim Ritzono Shemakom, says Rishon Yochai to Rishmael. No, when the Jewish people do the will of God, meaning they're learning Torah, Yomam V'Layla, learning Torah all day, they'll find other people to do their work for them. Shneamar, as the pasuk says, Vamdu Zarim Rutonechem. This is the bracha that's given to Am Yisrael. The other people will come and they will take care of your sheep for you. It was man Yisrael Sim. And when the Jewish people don't do what they're supposed to do, i.e., they don't learn Torah all the time, and they're involved in parnasa, they're involved in work, then they're going to have to do their own labor and gid as a punishment, as it were, for not doing the will of God. Shemar, Pasuk says, you shall then be forced. He understands this is a curse. You'll then be forced to harvest your wheat. Which Rabbi Yishmael understood it as a command. Go harvest your wheat. Go do what you need to do to live. Rabbi Yochai understands as a curse. If you don't follow the will of God and learn Torah all the time, you'll be forced to work. Furthermore, even other people's work will be upon you. Okay. So there's a famous machloket between Rabbi Yishmael, who says you should find a work Torah balanced life, and Rabbi Shimon Yochai, who says no, either it's all Torah or it's all work. You can't have a balance, and you're supposed to learn Torah all the time. We now jump to Bavel. Amar Abaye, Harbe Asu Rabbi Yishmael. Many did like Rabbi Yishmael said, Val Tabiadan, and they were successful. Meaning many people found a Torah work balance. They worked part of the time, they learned part of the time. They tried to find some way to work in learning and working and trying to create a more holistic lifestyle. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, many people did like Shimon Bar Yochai did, and they weren't successful. There are many people who tried to be like Shimon Bar Yochai and just learn all the time, hoping they would find parnas from somewhere else, and it didn't work. And now we get into a little realia. Realia, so Abaye and Rava, just to give us context, are two rabbis. They're third generation Amorim in Bavel. So if we're going to guess, this is 150 years after Shimon Bar Yochai, and a whole world apart. They're in Bavel, not in Eretz Yisrael, like Rabbi Shmuel and Shimon Bar Yochai were. So Rava tells us a story about the agricultural reality in Bavel. Amar lehu Rava l'Rabbanan. So Rava turned to the rabbis. I guess this really means his students in the yeshiva in Bavel. He turns to his students and he says, listen, b'matuto minaychu, please guys, b'yomei Nisan, which we've just left, Pesach time, u'b'yomei Tishrei, which is coming up, lo titchazu kamai. I don't want to see your faces. So here the Rosh Hashiva is saying to the students, in the month of Nisan and the month of Tishrei, which have the Chagim, and also those 2 times are labor-intensive times besides the Chagim. Meaning in Yomei Tishrei is when they finish the harvest and collect all the food, store it away for the winter, and start the plowing for the winter cycle. And Nisan is when they start the harvesting. So in those 2 times, which is very labor-intensive, I don't want to see you. Don't show up to yeshiva. Stay home. Because I don't want the whole year you're like have to work. I want you to put in the labor when it's appropriate, when it's the really, it's like tax season for accountants. I mean, accountants here, like, it's tax season. So during tax season, you got to put everything on hold and do that. Or I remember I had friends, I didn't go to YU, but I had friends at YU, like the med students, and before they came up to the MCATs, so they said, okay, we have to take off of cheer for a little while to prepare for the MCATs. So Rava and Abaye both seem to be following Rabbi Yishmael against Rosh Yochai. There has to be some balance. My father, again in Iowa, my father fought in World War II, but he told me before, when he was growing up in Iowa, he went to a small public school. He grew up in Grinnell. I think anyone else here is from Grinnell. There were 2 other Jewish families in Grinnell when he grew up there. He said in Grinnell he remembers that in certain parts of the year, the fall and in the early summer, the school was half empty because all the kids who were from farms were working on the farms at those times, and the high school had to kind of like work around the farmer schedule. So Rav is saying exactly that. I want you to work around the farmer schedule and make sure you work and make sure you learn. All that was the preamble, okay? Giving you kind of a picture. Are there any questions at this point or anything? We're good? Okay, we're good. Now I want to get to the famous case of Rabbi Shimon Yochai. Now most people, when I ask students, and someone else said here, they all automatically mention that Rabbi Shimon Yochai ran into the cave. Wherever the cave is, all kinds of disagreements on where exactly the cave is. It doesn't matter for our purposes. But we understand the kind of mentality of Shimon Yochai in regards to learning, that one should learn constantly Yomam V'Laila, as the pasuk in Yoshua says, and not stop. And we're going to see the complexity of Shimon Yochai as a person who's I want to say that he's I don't want to use the word extremist. But I would better term perhaps is absolutist. Well, Shimon Yochai is very much an absolutist in his approach to the world. And now we're going to look at another Agadah. The other one was a quasi-halachic Agadah. Now we're going to look at one that's purely Agadic. But it has perhaps implications on understanding the personality of Shimon Yochai and perhaps a larger picture. Okay? So, this is the cave story. It's really easy to remember where it is in the Talmud because it appears in Masechet Shabbat, Daf Lamed Gimel, and everyone talks to Shimon Yochai on Lag BaOmer. So it works out. It's a great mnemonic. We have a Shimon Yochai on Lag BaOmer, a log in Masechet Shabbat. So let's jump right in. The Gemara, a few lines earlier, mentioned that Rabbi Yehuda, remember now we're dealing with the whole group of people, a group of Rabbanim who were the students of Rabbi Akiva after his earlier students passed away. So the second set of students of Rabbi Akiva, and we're going to see part of the set here. So Rabbi Yehuda, in a few lines earlier, that's Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, who is quoted, he's considered the author of the regular person's quote in the Tosefta, one of the more important Rabbanim of that generation. Again, we're dealing with Eretz Yisrael around 150 or so. I guess after Rabbi Akiva passes away, and something like that. So Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, a few lines earlier, is referred to as Rosh HaMidabrim. You want to take a guess what Rosh HaMidabrim means? Rosh, head, speaker, the first speaker. So earlier on in the Gemara, when it quoted Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, it suggested that, we always go to him first. He always is the person who gets to speak up first. Now we're going to understand why. That's really the context of the Gemara is about Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, but we'll see it jumps into Shimon Bar Yochai. V'mai karu le'rosha medabrim b'kol makom. Why is it that Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai is called the first speaker? Why is he kind of elevated compared to the other rabbis, and is known that he is the one who has a certain prestige that other people don't? The Yatvi Rabbi Yehuda v'Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Shimon. So this is Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the students of Rabbi Akiva. The three of them were sitting around schmoozing. I don't know if, they're sitting around. Shimon Bar Yochai was not the type of person who sat around schmoozing too much, but one time, who knows, right after yeshiva or something, they came out and they were talking. V'yantiv Yehuda ben Gerim Gabayhu. His name is pregnant with meaning. What does ben Gerim mean? Anybody? Well, ben Gerim sounds like, yeah?
Converts.
Yeah, his parents were converts.
Yeah.
But that has implications. Some people are going to read him in a slightly sinister fashion, and some will read him in just a naive fashion. But clearly, Yehuda ben Gerim must have had relatives who were not Jewish, most likely, and certainly ran in circles, perhaps broader circles than some of the rabbis did. So the three rabbis are sitting around, Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon, and there's a guy who's a fly on the wall, and that's Yehuda ben Gerim. Patach Rabbi Yehuda v'amar. So Yehuda gets up and he says, looking around at the world, Kama na'im ma'asehem shel umma zo. How wonderful are the actions of this nation. Now, which nations are you referring to, obviously? There's post-Bar Kokhba during the, Hadrianic persecutions. The Romans. How great are the Romans? How so? Now, anyone who knows Monty Python will catch a Monty Python. I didn't know they learned Gemara, but there's clearly a Monty Python sketch right out of this. What did the Romans do? Tignu shvakim, they created markets. Tignu gsherim, they created bridges. Tignu merchatzaot, and they created bathhouses. Now, the Romans, to some degree, I've heard compared to Steve Jobs, or even truth of the matter is choose Microsoft as well, Bill Gates. But Steve Jobs, in regards to the iPhone, did not invent the iPhone. Steve Jobs discovered that someone had invented the iPhone, and he decided this was going to be a great invention and help market it. The same thing with Bill Gates. Bill Gates did not invent the original DOS, which is what started Microsoft. He bought DOS from another person. Some people say the Romans developed a lot of the ideas from the Greeks and others, but developed them into something huge. So here, Rabbi Yehuda says, look how great the Romans are. They created shvakim, markets. Now, one of the things that Roman architecture is known for is the Roman Forum. Forum was in the center of their whole area of the marketplace. So they developed very sophisticated marketplaces, which still exist. You can still see it in Rome today. They built a fancy in the Cardo in Israel, same thing, which is all from the Roman time. They really knew how to build these huge market centers. So they built markets, they built bridges. Now, of course, what's that referring to? It's not just they had a bridge. Anyone can have a bridge. Romans are very well known for developing the arch. In fact, outside, you don't really see arches outside my house, but outside in the front, you can look down and there's a famous Roman aqueduct, which runs all along from Neve Daniel, I believe. Part of it goes to the bottom of the front, and then the aqueduct continues and goes to Solomon's Pools. But they were great at building aqueducts. They were great at building roads. When I took Latin for a number of years, and one of the things we always studied was Roman road development. In fact, understanding Roman road development helps understand some Mishnayot, because, for instance, in Masechet Shabbat, they talk about whether or not a pillar, which is 9 tefachim tall, is what is that, and what does it count as far as space goes, and why they're always talking about these pillars that are 9 tefachim tall. The reason is that Roman roads in city urban centers, because chariots would run on the roads and create ruts in the roads, it would be filled with mud and dirt. They wanted to create places where people could cross. So Romans built these little pillars that people could actually step across without getting wet or muddy. And those are 9 tefachim tall, and that was kind of the design. So there are a number of things you can understand from Mishnayot from understanding basic issues in Roman architecture. So they built markets, they built bridges, they developed the arch and could build incredible bridges and whatnot. And they created bathhouses. Now, we know what a bathhouse is called in Latin. Any of those Latin people here? Before I embarrass myself with my bad Latin pronunciation. So a bathhouse is a basilica, which eventually will be taken over by the church and made into churches. But these huge bathhouses, those of you who've been to Masada have certainly seen the very sophisticated bathhouses. I spent a long time when I took Latin. We had to memorize every section of a bathhouse. Like, there was the hot pool, the caldarium, and the frigidarium, and the tepidarium, and how they built those mushrooms to heat the bathhouses. And so it's a big topic, and even in Chazal, I talk a lot about bathhouses. The famous bathhouse of Aphrodite, which is discussed in the mission of Avodah Zarah, Ron Gamliel. But in any event, they built these huge buildings. They really knew what they were doing. They're incredible architects. When I took Latin, we studied about Hadrian the Builder. That's what they called him. Hadrian the Builder, the great emperor of Rome. And of course, the Jews related to him as Hadrian the Destroyer, because he's the one who created the Hadrianic persecutions, which is what these rabbis are going to flee from. So it really depends on your perspective. So when I grew up in high school and we were learning all these wonderful things about how great Hadrian was, I didn't understand until later on that Hadrian was a pretty not great guy. In any event, so Hadrian built all these things. The Romans built them on his methodology. Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta is sitting there, and he's listening to Rabbi Yehuda pontificate about the glory of Roman architecture. Shatak, and he wants to contemplate. He doesn't want to say anything. But then Rashum Yochai was not exactly, seemingly not exactly a calm person. Again, he was a absolutist. Neder Rashum Yochai, Va'amar, and he said, no. You're praising them for building these great things, but the truth of the matter is they're not doing it for any good purpose. They're doing it for their own personal benefits, which are bad. How so? Let's look. Tiknu Shvakim, he says they created big markets. Those Shibahams don't know, because they want to create brothels, prostitution, slavery. They were horrible people. How can you praise what they did? Mirchat Sa'ot, why they build these bathhouses? La'adam behematzman, because they were so gluttonous and like to just enjoy themselves. It wasn't for any good, positive purpose of something, glorification of the world or benefiting the world. And Sherim, why they build bridges? He told him mechas, in order to tax people. Don't think it was for anyone's great benefit. So now, at first blush, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai is somebody looking at the wonders of the architectural marvels of the Romans, and it's hard. Rabbi Yochai doesn't disagree with that. The actual marvels might be something incredible. They were great architects. But he's looking at the meaning behind it all and saying, I don't care about the success of their projects if their goals were bad. I mean, maybe we'll unpack that a little bit, goals. But this is important because he's very disturbed by people's attitudes and not necessarily what they've accomplished, but why they accomplished it. So is the accomplishment great? I don't know that Yehuda would disagree with him on why the Romans did it. The Romans weren't necessarily good people. I don't think Yehuda loved them. He was oppressed by them. But nonetheless, he might be able to appreciate that they created these incredible wonders. Rosh Yochai says it's all worthless because what counts is people's attitude. Okay. Now, Halach Yehuda ben Gerin. And number 2 here. Now we have a problem. Yehuda ben Gerim goes, V'siper divrehem. Now he went and told what the rabbi said. Why did he tell what the rabbi said? We don't know. We don't know why he told it. It could be that he was telling on them. I don't know. That would be a little surprising, but maybe that's how some people read it. Others give him the benefit of the doubt and said he was just so excited about this discussion that he was schmoozing with his family. He came home and told his family, told his mom and pa. They were all talking about it, and they told the cousins, and the cousins worked for the Romans. So somehow or other, loose lips sink ships, and he kind of spread this idea around. V'yishmu l'malchut, and the Romans heard about it. Amru Yehuda she'ileh, and the Romans decided to respond. Rabbi Yehuda, who praised us, yitaleh, he should be raised up. And this, by the way, is why Rabbi Yehuda bar Ilai is called Rosh HaMidabrim, because of the story. So the Romans gave him kind of some amount of authority. Yossi sheshatak, but Yossi was silent. Mida keneged Mida. We will, there's karma here. Yigalel Tzipori. We'll kick him out and send him up north to Tzipori. Shimon, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, shegineh yareg. We're going to kill him. He cursed us. He said that we Romans are bad, which might be true, but he said the Romans are bad. We're going to kill him. Now we get to the story of hiding. And usually, I ask students, where do you hide? And they all go, the cave. But that's not true. There are 2 events, and we'll see in 3 and 4, they start the same way, Azal. There are 2 events, and the 2 events are very important to understand the overarching concept that Chazal are trying to get out of this little piece of Agadah. So what about hiding? Azalhu uvarei, so he and his son went, Tashu be'midrasha. Where did they go hide? In a Beit Midrash. I don't know, are there any Edgar Allan Poe fans here? When I was in high school, I went to high school, I was very into English literature, and one of the literary greats that they loved in my high school for some reason was Edgar Allan Poe. So I became a big Poe fan. We read a lot of Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe is known for his kind of macabre tales, The Fall of the House of Usher, and Cask of Amontillado, and those type of things. But in certain literary circles, Edgar Allan Poe is known as the inventor of the detective novel, the modern detective novel. So one of his more famous detective stories is called The Purloined Letter. Anyone by chance have read The Purloined Letter? So where's the best place to hide something? That's what Poe asked. Where's the best place to hide something? So in The Purloined Letter, it's a detective is trying to find a letter which is incriminating evidence against someone, and they go into the house and they're searching everywhere. They search every crevice, they search the bedroom, etc. And where do they find it? There's a desk, a letter desk, and in the letter holder in the letter desk is the letter. In other words, sometimes the best place to hide something is in plain sight. So Yehuda bar Shimon Yochai goes and hides in a Beit Midrash. Where else would you find a rabbi? In a Beit Midrash. So he goes and hides in a Beit Midrash. Maybe there was no one else there because of the Hadrianic persecutions and the Romans clamping down. Maybe he just thought he'd hide in plain sight. We don't know. So he goes and hides in a Beit Midrash. Kol Yoma Havamaiti Lahu Divitayu Rifta Vikuzudamayim. These are very important symbols. Chazal don't just toss things out. The stories are not historical stories. The stories are trying to convey something. We're going to see that the symbols are kind of flashing to you symbols. So their wives brought them every day rifta. Rifta is bread. So brought them a loaf of bread, the kuzudamaya, and a pitcher of water. So every day when they were hiding in the Beit Midrash, the only people who knew, I guess, were the wives, and the wives would bring them bread and water. Vikarche, and they would make a karich. Karich in Hebrew is a sandwich, but really in the Gemara, it means to eat. So they would eat. However, they could only do this for a little while. It's kind of like Moshe in the being preserved for 3 months before he got too loud. Kitakif Gzeirata, when the Hadrianic persecution started to become more difficult, Amarli Lebre, Nashim Datan Kalehen. This is a famous, very difficult phrase. he says to his son, women da'atan kala alehen. Many people interpret this phrase as thinking that it means that women are not necessarily intelligent. But in this context, it clearly doesn't mean that. And it's used several times the same way it's used in this Gemara. What's a continuation? What does it mean that their dot is kal? That their mind is light? What does that mean? Dilma mitzare la umegalyalan. Maybe they'll be tortured and reveal us. In other words, datan kal doesn't mean anything about intelligence here. It means will. Can they suffer torture? So Rabbi Shimon Yochai is afraid that his wife might get tortured to say where he is, and they'll get caught and be executed. So he decides to go run and hide so no one knows where he's going. That's basically what's happening in the first part of the story. So just to recap, they went ahead to Beit Midrash. Their wives brought them bread and water. And what are they doing in the Beit Midrash, by the way? What are you doing in Beit Midrash? What's someone doing in Beit Midrash? Also, what?
Supposed to be learning.
You learn Torah, right? So that's what they were doing. They were getting food and water for their wives. They're learning Torah. They're inside a Beit Midrash. Very important pieces. And Rosh Yochai, that's his natural place to go because he's a person who says you should learn all the time. Now we get to the cave. Number 4. Azu Tashu b'marata. They went, same thing. It almost reminds me of Sefer Yonah. Sefer Yonah has 2 beginnings as well, just like this, kind of in parallel. So they go and they hide. Tashu means to hide. B'marata, in a cave. Itrachish nisa. Itrachish is just the common rabbinic term for a miracle happening, and then the noun miracle. A miracle happened. What was the miracle? Ivrei lahu charuva. Anyone know what a charuva is? A carob tree all over Israel. A carob tree blossomed, I guess, grew instantly in front of the cave. V'aina damaya. Aina damaya is a mayan, the spring. V'havu mishalchu. Now it gets a little odd. Now it gets a little weird. Mishalchu minayu. Minayu is their clothing. They got naked. What in the world are they getting naked? I mean, that's just weird, right? They stripped. V'havu yadve ad sivarayu, and they would sit up to their necks. Chala. What's chala? Chol, sand. They sat their necks in sand, blocked by this carob tree, not wearing clothing, and there's water spring. What are they talking about? Like, what in the world are Chazal talking about? Now, if you're walking by the cave and you saw them when they were up to their necks in sand, what would you see?
Heads.
Heads without bodies. Okay, that's important. So Kula Yoma Garse, all day they learned. The Idan Sluye, the time of davening, Lavshu, they would get dressed, Michasu, cover themselves, Umatzlu, and pray. Vahadar Mishalche Minaihu, and then they would take off their clothing. Why did they take off their clothing? Now the Gemara explains it. Kihechi, in order that lo livlu, they wouldn't disintegrate. So they didn't want their clothes to disintegrate, therefore they took them off. Itvu trace Arshani Marata, and they spent 12 years in the cave. Let's go to 5, then we're going to unpack all of this. Number 5. Yeah, I want to do number 5 and 6. We'll go back. Onto Eliyahu. So Eliyahu on a V comes. Eliyahu on a V is also a symbol, and hopefully we'll come back to talk about his symbolism in a few minutes. V'kam Pitra de Marata, and he stands in the front of the cave. Amar, and he declares, Man lodi labar Yochai to make Caesar ubatok zerate. Who will tell him that the Caesar died, a Hadrian died, and the Xera has been nullified? So now they know, right? Because he whispers it. Nafku, they go out. Chazu inchi de karve vizare. they go out and they see people plowing and sowing. It relates to the Gemara we saw before, plowing and sowing. And we know Shimon Yochai doesn't like people plowing and sowing the seeds. Amar, Manichin Chayolim, Moskim Chayisha. Rabbi Shimon Yochai freaks out and says, look what they're doing. They're abandoning the world to come because not learning Torah, and they're engaged in this world by planting. And look what happens. Kol makom shonina nehem miyad nisraf. Everywhere they looked, and they're so angry, everything burned. And now look, Yatz de Batkol. I love this Gemara, by the way. I love this. There's so much here, and we'll unpack a lot of it. It's so thick with powerful images that Chazal are trying to convey. Yatz de Batkol. Now a heavenly voice comes. Before, by the way, who told him to leave the cave? Eliyahu, not a heavenly voice. That's important too. Heavenly voice comes and says, Vamra lehem, lachrivo amiyatzatem. Have you come out of the cave to destroy my world? My world, right? You can't see me going like that. My world, says the Batkol. The Batkol's God, right? Chizul maratchem, go back to your cave. Real quickly in 6, Hadu Azulant Vitrace Yarche Shata, they go back to the cave, they spend 12 months there, which is a year. Amri Risham Gehenim Shtema Sar Chodesh. They said the punishment for evildoers in hell is 12 months. Hell. They refer to it as hell. 12 months. Yatza Batkol, this time a heavenly voice speaks to them, not Eliyahu, but a heavenly voice. Vamra, Tzumaratchem, leave the cave. Nafku, and they came out. Rabbi Lazar, Rishon Yochai's son, is still angry, and everywhere he looks, Havi Masi, everywhere he looked, he kind of destroyed. He was still angry and causing fires. Mas Rabbi Shimon, Rishon Yochai would heal the places. Amar lo bani dailo lamani vata. The world can suffice with you and me, just learning all the time. Let those people plow. Then we have a little coda to the story, but I want to unpack the story. Just to go through a few of the pieces, originally they went to a Beit Midrash, and we discussed you learn Torah in a Beit Midrash. Then they go to a cave, and they were learning Torah in the cave. In the case of Beit Midrash, every day someone brought them water and bread. In the case of the cave, they had a carob tree, in fact, a miracle carob tree. It says Itrachis Nisa, a miracle carob tree, and a miracle spring sprung up. In the cave, they were learning Torah. In the Beit Midrash, learning Torah. In the cave, learning Torah. And the cave, they take off and become like these heads surrounded by sand. And that sand, they do that in order their clothes won't be destroyed. And that is a key to the whole unpacking the whole story. There's a story that we know of other people who were surrounded by sand and their clothes were not destroyed. Anyone know what that's referring to? Who was surrounded by sand, but their clothing were not destroyed?
Jews in the desert.
Yafeh. So let's look here in Sefer Devarim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe is reminding, this is near the end of Sefer Devarim, and Moshe is reminding the people of Israel their experience in the Midbar, and he says, quoting God, Volechetchem 40 shana midbar. I, God, led you 40 years in the desert. Lubalu salmatchem, your clothing was not destroyed. Same exact word that Chazal were using. Malay from you. Menalcha lo balta, and your shoes were not destroyed. Maraglecha. Lechem lo achaltem. You didn't eat bread, because what did you eat in the desert?
Man.
Man. Where did the man come from?
Upstairs.
Upstairs, the sky, right? A carob tree. I don't know if people have seen carob trees. They lived off of carobs. Where are carobs growing? On the tree, right? They're growing on a tree above their heads. And what did Am Yisrael drink in the Midbar? When the Am Yisrael were in the desert, what did they drink? Yaim v'shechar lo shatitem. What? They drank well water, spring water. Where did the spring come from?
Stone.
It's Miriam. It followed in the desert. It was miracle. They don't have water. Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to a rock. They don't have water. Moshe Rabbeinu hits a rock. Following them around is miracle water. and miracle bread. They're surrounded by sand, right? And what did they do in the desert? What did they get in the desert?
They learned
Bar
Torah.
Hashem, the Kol Hashem. They got Torah in the desert. When Rosh Shimon notes, let's just look here. I'm going to skim down a little bit. 1 second.
What was the role of the sand in the desert? They were enclosed in sand?
Well, they're surrounded by sand. The Am Yisrael were surrounded by sand. It's a wasteland. The desert's a wasteland. I think the most way you can see they're surrounded is by the fact that they totally alienated their bodies. If their bodies don't count, they're just heads communing with God in the cave. So we have the Beit Midrash. Yeah.
But in the desert, where did the sand go? They didn't go naked. Maybe that's the beginning of.
No, but their clothes didn't get destroyed. Their clothes didn't get destroyed in both places. So I think that's a symbol Chazal are trying to clue you in to what's going on there. So in the Beit Midrash parallels the cave, and the bread parallels the miracle. By the way, in Chazal, in numerous Agadot, carob is kind of represented as a staple. What people ate. They didn't have bread, they had carobs. In this case, it's a miracle carob falling from the sky. Is very similar to the man falling from the sky. Whereas they had water in the Beit Midrash, they had miracle spring water. In the Beit Midrash, they learned Torah. In the cave, they eventually got a bat kol, but they learned Torah. When Rosh Yochai goes to run and hide from the Romans, he's the person who's kulo Torah. That's all he wants is Torah. He wants to be an intellectual head without worrying about anything the body needs. And therefore, where does he run to? He runs to the cave, which is symbolic of running back to Har Sinai. He thought the ideal experience for the Jew was simply to learn Torah with God all the time, going back up top here. And therefore, he runs to the cave, and he wants to commune with God, just like he ran to the Beit Midrash to commune with God. And that's the model. And by the way, and that will protect him. That'll protect him from everything. But now, when he leaves the cave, who told him? Eliyahu told him, not God. Eliyahu tells him to leave the cave. He didn't merit having a bat kol yet. He didn't merit having God talk to him because the cave, in a symbolic way, is the midbar. He ran to the midbar and he thought that was the ideal. And when he realizes, when he comes out and says, oh my gosh, the ideal Jewish experience is be one with God, learning Torah all the time, and you can ignore the body. He comes out, when he leaves the cave, physically, symbolically, leaving the cave is crossing the border from the midbar to Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, in order to live, you have to plow and you have to plant and you have to reap, right? It's not the midbar experience. It's fine in the Netziv. I just wrote a Dvar Torah for this base. The Netziv is something not on our Agadah, but a similar idea is introduction to Bamidbar. That's the experience. He used Kabbalistic terms, but it doesn't matter. The experience of Am Yisrael in the desert was one of communion with God, but its goal was never to be the ultimate. The ultimate was Eretz Yisrael. Yeah, Paul.
But how comes that he knew what the Romans were building bridges, and if he was learning Torah all day before he went into the cave, how did he know that what the Romans were building?
Well, it says that they were sitting around schmoozing, and Rabbi Yehuda made that comment, and he responded to that comment.
Yeah, but how could he react if he didn't know?
Well, I mean, I guess he would have known. He was, living in Israel, and he saw those things. He just thought the ideal even in Israel was really just to commune with God, was just to learn Torah. But he certainly lived in Israel and saw everything. It wasn't until he went to the cave that he stopped seeing everything.
But Shimon bar Yochai went one step further. He said that, sorry, Phil, he went one step further. He said that what they were using it for. That means he knew what was going on around the world.
For sure, because he was living in Israel, he saw it.
He wasn't in the Daled Amot of Torah all the day, or during his lifetime. Maybe.
I guess Yehuda could have said to him, why are you looking around? Why aren't you just concentrating? But, I guess even he took a few walks around the block every once in a while. Yeah.
He didn't have to know anything. He didn't have to know anything in order to respond the way he did. He didn't have to know a thing. I don't agree. He didn't have to know anything. He responded.
Okay.
to what Rabbi Yehuda said, who said, they're building roads. And he just said, well, they're doing it for themselves. He didn't have to know anything. He didn't have to see a road. He didn't
Okay.
have to even know it was
Besides
true.
that, they spent 10 years in isolation.
12
right?
years, yeah.
12 years. What were they using? Torah Shabbat Peh? They had a library there?
They had, in that time, everything was ball pad. Everything was in their minds, right? Memorized everything. The Mishnah was all this is before the Mishnah, although without getting into technical details, there's every reason to believe that, according to Tosafta, Rabbi Akiva actually started putting the Mishnah together way before, whatever it was. I guess it would have been like 70 years before Yehuda Hanasi put the Mishnah together. Rabbi Akiva already was doing that, but they had tons of Torah. If you look at the beginning of Adiyot, which takes place immediately after they left the Beit HaMikdash, when the Korban Beit HaMikdash happened, so that's when they went to Yavne, and it says they all collected together all the Mishnayot they already knew. So the Torah Shabbat Peh was all in their minds, and they just ordered it. So they were learning, Torah Shabbat Peh. I saw recently someone discussing the Rambam. Says one should learn at night because the majority of your learning is at night, so never go a night without learning. And I saw someone comment they never realized before that must have been, the Rambam must have been talking about stuff that was memorized because you couldn't really see so well with lamplight, and you're staying late at night. And indeed, the Rambam himself discusses this in The Guide to the Perplexed. The part of learning is just contemplating what you've already learned. So they had all this in their minds. Everything was oral. So they were sitting reviewing oral Torah and hoping to have like some communion with God, as it were, and thinking that's the idyllic experience of Jewish people, is a constant communion with the divine. But the irony is they come out, and when they see people actually participating in the building of Israel, the plowing and planting, they get all upset and say, no, you're supposed to commune with God, and God is the one who speaks to them. Right? Before it was only El Navi. Now God speaks to them and says, you're trying to destroy my world. My world was to live in Eretz Yisrael and have Am Yisrael build Eretz Yisrael and have a healthy balance. And you just want to be in that cave, so go back to the cave. Okay, gives what to hate. We don't need you here. And then Yochai goes back to the cave and understands it's so powerful. Right? He goes back and says 12 months is the punishment for Rishaim and Gehenna. This is not heaven, this is hell. In other words, it's not idyllic. The ideal was never to be the Bamidbar experience. It was never supposed to be. That might have been what starts it. But the goal is to be in Israel, which includes building the land and having a parnasa and also learning both in unison. And Rosh Yochai, Nofel Asimon, he finally realized that truth, but his son didn't quite get it. And that's why he leaves the cave and comes out. He comes out and can realize that, no, you have to also be not a disembodied head. You can't be a head without a body. You need the body, right? The goal is to have a whole person, a head and a body. The symbols are very potent. The academic elite cannot be disconnected from the people. It could be that one needs people who learn all the time. He says, well, you and me, son, we're good enough if we are this rabbinic leadership, but you need the entire people as a whole to build a society. Now, just to go to the coda of the story in number 7 here, Bahadi Pani Dumali Shabta, one Erev Shabbos, Chazuhau Saba to Havanaki Tre Madani Asa. They see an old man walking around with two myrtle leaves, right? Beautifully smelling myrtle leaves, Hadassin. Virahid Ben Hashmashon, he was running Erev Shabbos because he wanted to get home for Shabbat with the myrtle leaves he had picked. Amrule, Hani Lamalach. So Rabbi Shimon Yochai and his son say to this old man, why are you running with these 2 myrtle leaves? Amarlahu Lichvod Shabbat. Because I want to honor the Shabbos. I guess good smell for Shabbat. Maybe he'll say bracha bisamim al Shabbos. I don't know. So they turn to him as like lamdanim. They're like yeshiva bachrim, right? Because they have spent 12 months in the cave. Or 12 years in the cave, and another 12 months in the cave, 13 years in the cave altogether. And they say to him, Batiskalach Machad? He said, wouldn't it be enough just to have one myrtle? If the whole goal is to smell, you only need one. So the old man replies to them, Chad Keneged Zachor, V'chad Keneged Shamor. No, I want two because I want to like fulfill the Torah as much as possible. Amar le levrei. So Shimon turns to his son and looks. Chazu kama chavim mitzvot al Yisrael. Do you see how precious the mitzvot are? They go beyond the letter of the law. They're not making all these technical things, but rather they're trying to really glorify the mitzvot. Yatev datayu, and that calmed them down. So I think Chazal are saying something very, very powerful here. There is a tendency, and Rabbi Yochai represents this tendency to try and flee the world and say that the academic experience, the yeshiva, in this case Har Sinai, is kind of like the ultimate model. And the rabbis themselves, there's a self-critique. A self-critique is saying, no, that's not really the model that God set forth for us. The model is one that has a holistic society that is building society by building things and developing plowing and reaping and harvesting and having stores and having a full cosmopolitan society and Torah and finding a synthesis. Now, I don't know if this story is supposed to take place before or after the first Agadah that we learned about the disagreement between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yochai. It's interesting, by the way, if we go back to that Gemara for a second, just quickly for a second, in Abaye's explanation of Rabbi Yochai, he says, Harbe asuk Rabbi Yishmael v'al tabiyadan. Many people did what Rabbi Yishmael said. To review, Rabbi Yishmael said, find a synthesis. And it worked. Many people did Rabbi Yochai v'lo al tabiyadan. And it didn't work. Now, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, coming out of the Vilna Gaon school of thought, which were very, in many ways, one can imagine, are the Rabbi Yochai school. The Vilna Gaon talks about learning all the time, and in Volozhin they had a 24-hour mishmar where they learned Torah all the time because they believed the world would stop functioning, would stop spinning if they didn't learn Torah all the time. So when Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, Nefesh Chaim explains this Gemara, I was very excited when I came across this by learning Nefesh Chaim. He says the key word he feels, again, Nefesh Chaim Volozhin feels the key word here is Harbe Asu. Lots of people try to do it. You can't have a society where everybody decides they just want to stop and learn. If that's the case, it will fall apart. And that's exactly what Rabbi Yochai learned, is that it's enough for him and his son to be like the people who learn and work with the other people. But when many people try with Rabbi Yochai, it was a major failure. So it has to be, perhaps there are those people who will go and learn for many years and become the rabbinic establishment and write the tshuvot, etc. But for a society to function, you really need the entire society. And that, I think it's so beautiful, this idea that the Bamidbar experience, the Jews receiving the Torah, and many people think, well, that's the ideal. Let me go back to the desert. Let me go back and sit with God. God never meant that. That's what the point of this Gemara is, I think. God never meant for us to all be sitting and learning all the time and cutting ourselves out from building the world. He rather wanted a full society with every component to it. I'll throw it as an addendum, then I'll take a couple questions. There's a famous Chassam Sofer. Chassam Sofer wrote this in at least two different places. He wrote it in his Chidushim on the Gemara in Sukkah. He also appears in Torah Moshe's commentary on the Chumash. He says, based on this Gemara, it would appear this Gemara, the first Gemara we looked at, the conclusion of the Gemara seems to be the ideal is to work and learn, not just to learn. He says, here we are in Budapest, in Pressburg, and we're just I'm promoting a Kollel life. I sit and learn all the time. Is that the right thing to do? So the Chassam Sofer says something wild, and he says, well, the Agadah, it doesn't fit perfectly with Rav and Abaye, actually, but he says the Agadah, Rabbi Yochai, Rabbi Yishmael, and whatnot, and working and finding a balance of working and whatever. He says they're all Tanaim living in Israel, living in Eretz Yisrael. He says here we're in the land of the non-Jews, of the Gentile nations. He says here in the land of the Gentile nations, maybe one could argue that working is not a mitzvah. He says, but in Eretz Yisrael, every time you do something to build the land, right, plowing is itself a mitzvah. So the Chassam Sofer at least felt that the Tzli Agadah applies to Eretz Yisrael. You have to have a holistic society. I would argue beyond him that really seems to be the goal. Har Sinai, God gave us the Torah, but what was the end result? To bring it to Eretz Yisrael and find a work Torah balance of learning Torah, building Eretz Yisrael, and really finding that synthesis of the two. So Chassam Sofer would say Torah Mada is a great thing, but it should only take place in Israel. I don't know if you have to say that, but certainly it's true in Eretz Yisrael, which was the goal of leaving the Midbar, was to come to Eretz Yisrael and build Artseinu HaKedusha. At this point, are there any questions? I mean, I guess I could stop sharing. Should I stop sharing? I'll stop the share so I can see everybody's face. Yeah. Any questions or whatnot? Pretty clear. We're all happy. Everyone's free to Zoom. So I'll just conclude as I started. The Rav Hutner explains the Vilna Gaon in regards to Bet Sivan, that on the second day of Sivan is when we receive the command to be Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. So God chose the people. And he quotes the Vilna Gaon as explaining Birkat. There were two stages in receiving the Torah. There was receiving the Torah today, which is God selecting us to be the recipients of the Torah. Tem Tiyuli Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. And the second element of receiving the Torah is actually Vav Sivan, which is my birthday, of Ma'amad Har Sinai in a few days on Shavuot. And we actually reflect that in Birkat Torah. When we say a bracha on Birkat Torah, we say Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, V'Asher Natan Lanu Et Torah. And the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, says those are two time periods. Bet Sivan today, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, that God selected us to be the recipients of the Torah. And then again, Asher Natan Lanu Et Torah appears on Shavuot in a few days' time. So I want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach. We should all pray for Shalom Al Yisrael and that all these horrible things should stop. We went from a pandemic to the horrible things in Meron to this. I know my students have just been juggling from calamity to calamity. We should all pray that in the Schutosha, Rishon Yochai, and all the Tanaim and Amorim and all the Limud Torah that we do, that it should be Magen Aleinu, and that we should have Shalom in Artseinu HaKedusha. We can go back to what we're supposed to be doing, which is building Eretz HaKodesh and living together in a Torah and work society.
Thank you.
Amen. Thank you.
Everyone have a Chag Sameach. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.